Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our night talking about disasters and preparedness and what we can do. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names and new faces and names. So first, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm going to welcome you from where I am, and I encourage you to drop in the chat the traditional lands that you're on, if you know what it is. So I'm welcoming you from here in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And for those who know it as Canada or Nova Scotia, its colonial name, this is the land of the Dawnland people. So in Turtle Island, this is where the sun comes up first. And we greet the day here as it rises in the ocean. I'm just grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be with you, but I'm grateful to be on this land that's been tended by so many people so well for time, and to be allowed to be here. So thank you to the Mi'kmaq people, the territory I'm on, and thank you for those who are acknowledging the territories you're on. So my name is Charles Williams. I'll be presenting some tonight, and we have, I guess it's this, I don't know what side you're on. Leila.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leila, and I will be also speaking and presenting tonight. And I'm joining you from the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Qualicum and Snaha First Nations on so-called Vancouver Island, Canada as well.
So before we leap into our discussion tonight, I'd like you all just to take a deep breath and just allow yourself to settle here for this next hour and a half as we talk. If there's things that are distracting to you, feel free to take care of them as we talk. Just remember to keep your mic muted. But if you can, just let go of anything and just allow yourself to be here for this next little bit. So settle in and hope you enjoy. And I first want to start with we're talking this night and we're talking about disaster, and I find it an interesting word because in ecology we have disturbance, right? There's like without judgment, like in the world there's disturbance, and some of that disturbance can be disaster. So where I am right now, we had this thing that happens that could be a disaster. It happens, it gets very cold and dark, and there's snow, the rain turns to solid things and it falls on the ground. It's very slippery and like, but it's not a disaster. Like here in Nova Scotia, we're like, we call it winter. We're like, whatever, it happens every year. We're ready for it. But if where I was living before in California, just out of the bay, if it did that there, like disaster, like we've got a disaster, there's white things falling from the sky. What are we gonna do? It's disaster and disturbance really relate to how it impacts our lives, right? So we have all this disturbance that happens, and we often say disaster. What is it? Like fire, flood, hurricane. But that's not the disaster. The disaster is that it impedes some of our needs. Like, are we able to get our needs met? Our food, our water, our shelter, our friends, our community? Like, are we able to take care of the ones we love? Like, that's the disaster. The disaster is that we're not able to do the things that we need to. And some of it is strictly around planning, like poor planning. Like, why is it not a disaster to have 4 to 6 inches of snow where I live, but where I was in California? Because there's not any planning for it. They don't have the infrastructure for it. If we have a fire that comes through an area, or even floods are a better example. I grew up in Illinois, middle of the United States, near the Mississippi River, and they built these things called dikes. They try to keep the river in, and then the great goddess would be like, whatever, every once in a while, and be like, jump outside of it, and there's a disaster. But if you don't build in the floodplain, it's not a disaster. All the ecology of the floodplains, the trees and all the plants that live in the floodplain evolved for it, and they need it. Like, it's incredibly necessary for it to flood. It's not a disaster. It's like part of life, and it's an important part of life. And I challenge us as we think about disaster to think about it slightly differently. Like, how can we design our lives so that when disturbance happens, it isn't a disaster? Like, what can we do to both prepare for and engage with in a way that builds what we need instead of destroys the things that we need. So just to plug that in as we get started to talk about like how do we think about this as something that we can engage with, and to know that there's a lot of privilege in this. And we'll talk more about that because sometimes people end up in spaces that are more in danger, not because they had poor planning, it's because of what they were born into or what they were forced into. So just holding that is part of it, the essence of it too. But how can we do that? So disaster and disturbance, they don't have to be the same thing, but sometimes they are. And what do we do? And that's where we have Leila here, whichever side she has on for you. I don't know if it's mirrored or not this time, is going to talk to us a little more about that.
Because I'm a disaster. No. I'm really happy to chat about disasters. For folks who don't know me, in my day jobs, I work doing a lot of disaster response and recovery for the last 7, 8 years. I've worked with different governments and different nonprofits. A lot of the experience and where I've learned a lot and been taught a lot comes from New Orleans. I want to honor that in doing hurricane response and flood response and pandemic response down in New Orleans, and also up here in Canada and BC and doing flood responses and wildfires and things like that. And so I'll be sharing a bit from that perspective. And one of the things in kind of Charles and I kind of coming together to have this evening is that we really also wanted to center the idea of, there's a lot of stuff around disasters, around being really prepared and like having your kits and having your plan and kind of this like, your family, your home. And we want to touch on that briefly. You could do a whole like couple hours on that, but we're just going to touch on it briefly tonight because we want to move more into that place of how do we support our communities and how do we show up for each other in disaster in a way that we are going to be facing, because we're already facing it, but as the future kind of rolls in, we're getting more and more disasters that are intensifying and extreme weather and things like that. And so how can we be ready for that as much as we can and in a way that really lifts people up and helps us come together, because it's going to be happening more and more. So we wanted to kind of create the space to kind of talk about that and how we can kind of step into that. So I will get started on the presentation part. And then at the end, we are going to do like discussion and some things like that. If you have questions, please pop them into the chat and we will get to that, or at some point we might answer it in the text throughout. But I will share my screen. Also, I'm loving seeing where everybody's from. There's a lot of neat places showing up. 1 second. Okay. Boom. Okay. So we're all here. We're going to be talking about disasters, but in the lens of, again, mutual aid, community response, and recovery. Again, we don't have a lot of time with y'all today, so we're going to be touching on things fairly briefly, but wanted to get us thinking as we go into the summer season, where extreme heat and wildfire and a whole bunch of other things, hurricanes, floods, all that seems to kind of accelerate a little bit as we go into summer. So wanted to have that conversation. So just as I was mentioning, summer is the time where we see, a whole bunch of different hazards that, sometimes winter, at least in Canada, it feels like a little bit of a reprieve, and in other parts of the States as well. But with summer comes hurricane season in the South. Wildfire risk goes up in the West and in other parts of North America as well. We can always have extreme rain events from just extreme rain or tropical storms or hurricanes that lead to flooding. And we also see things like tornadoes as well. And then extreme heat domes have become more and more prevalent all over North America. And with that, we also are seeing more wildfire. And even where we have places where, communities might be getting impacted and displaced by wildfires, the impacts of wildfires with the wildfire smoke is hitting people far, far, far away from that and causing impacts and crises for people in other places, even if their homes aren't threatened. So that's a big smorgasbord of nasty things. And in any given summer, you might be living in a community where this is a very high risk, or you might be living in a community where people who are living in a high risk area might end up coming to you and might end up being hosted by you if they are displaced. And I think the other thing to mention with this is with climate change, some places that we thought weren't necessarily going to have things like heat domes and extreme heat events or, hurricanes or whatnot are getting more impacted by those things. And so it's important to kind of really be prepared, even if that's not something that has happened in the past. Now we're going to start off just with a quick thing in terms of talking about some disaster preparedness, because if you're going to help other people, you need to be solid with yourself. It's kind of like that medic rule of making sure you kind of, make sure that you are ready to do the work and you are safe. And so just want to talk through some really quick things around preparedness in terms of supplies, as well as a few other pieces. So this is a common thing in emergency preparedness. It's important to have a go bag as well as a home kit. And the go bag is the idea that sometimes when we have to evacuate, especially when it's something like a wildfire and you don't get a lot of notice, you need to have something ready to go. And it's not something that you might have time to put together. So making sure you have something, if you have a car, in your car is a good idea. And that is usually can be a duffel bag, it can be a backpack. You can see a list of things that you would normally have in there, but a pair of clothes to change into, any essential personal hygiene items, having a sleeping bag in case you end up in a shelter. It's nicer than sometimes the thin little blankets that you get. Making sure you have your ID, that is really helpful and important. Or even like copies of it, right? If that's an issue. Having cash on hand, a list of emergency contacts. Oftentimes when people have to evacuate really quickly, they don't always have their phone on them, or something happens to their phone and then they don't have a way to reach some of the people they love, because we've gotten way too technological and we store everything in our phone. So if you can put a list of emergency contacts in your bag, that's helpful. Medications are really important if you're someone who needs medications, or if you have a family member who needs medications, making sure that is included in your to-go kit, because that just will make any kind of prolonged stay away from home a lot easier. If you wear prescription glasses or contacts, if you have an extra pair, making sure that goes in your go kit as well. If there's a miniature first aid kit, that's a helpful thing to have. If you have a pet, you want to make sure you pack things for them in terms of their food and a toy or something. Any documents that will prove where you live, things like insurance policies and your house deed or whatnot. That's for like if you end up displaced for a while and you need to apply for different insurance and financial aid, it helps to have those documents. Snacks are helpful because you don't want to be hangry. PPE, because we are still in a pandemic, it helps to have masks if you end up in like a high volume place, or if you're dealing with wildfire smoke, right? And that can also help kind of minimize some of those impacts. Earplugs, because that can help if you end up again in a situation like a shelter. And then if you have babies or children as part of your team, you want to have things like diapers and formula packed in there as well. Usually where you're going, you can eventually get these things and there'll be donations and there'll be, recovery and resilience centers set up, but it can take a while. So having it with you in a vehicle, if you have a vehicle, or just even in a bag by the door, is a good thing to consider. Now, the other thing that you should have ready, kind of going into any major disaster season, is a home kit. And that is more like you could have it in like a tote or something a bit larger. You want to have food. Usually in emergency management, they say food for 3 days, but now more people are saying you should be aiming for 7 to 10 days. And this is like non-perishable food, shelf-stable food, things that don't necessarily require refrigeration and things like that. Making sure you have enough water, because that is very, very important. You can see 3 gallons of water per person. Having things like a non-electric can opener, because it's great if you have lots of cans, but if you can't open it, it's kind of awkward. Flashlights, batteries, matches or lighter. A bigger first aid kit, I think, is a really important thing to have. If you do have prescription medication, having a week's supply if possible, or even just having certain over-the-counter things that you think might be helpful in terms of pain management and things like that. Again, if you have like a pet and a creature friend, making sure you have enough food and water and things for them for at least, again, like if you can go like 3 days to 7 days. If you have a generator, that is something that I think it's expensive, but it's really, really helpful to have a generator, especially if you're living in places where the power goes out a lot. I think like, again, when I used to live in New Orleans, you always want to be friends with someone who has a generator. So generators are helpful. A cooler, if you got to keep things cool, having things like any kind of camping equipment, like camp stove or grill, tents, and then kind of anything that would help kind of clean and sanitize hands and surfaces. So that's a lot of stuff. And again, not everybody has the financial means to put all of this together, but try to do the best you can. And if you do have a lot of financial means, try to do this also for other people and help other folks kind of have some of these items so that people can be better prepared. But some of the key things there, again, it's like you want to make sure you have your medications. You want to make sure you have essentials for babies and pets and things like that. You can always get clothes somewhere else, but you really want to have those things that are going to keep you from getting into crisis. Now, emergency plans, like if you are in an area that you think you might have to evacuate, knowing and having a bit of an idea of where you could go. And maybe it's like, that you have family who lives in this other city, or you have friends who live in this other place. And that's a place that you could go and stay for a while, or even for like a few days while you figure things out. That's just important to kind of think through and make sure that other people who love you know what your plans are. If you don't have a vehicle or a way to evacuate, making sure that you have talked to or have, either folks who will give you a ride, or if you're living in a community where they are actually doing kind of assisted evacuation, understanding those programs and some of those pieces can be helpful. But yeah, the emergency planning piece is just knowing where you want to go potentially if you had to leave, and also who you would want to make sure you bring with you and who you want to notify. You can get a lot more technical, but those are some of the main pieces. And again, when we're dealing with things like hurricanes and wildfires, there is the real risk and need for people to evacuate, and sometimes to evacuate really quickly. And if that's the case, you just want to familiarize yourself with potential evacuation routes, as well as, if there are any programs. Like I used to work for the city of New Orleans, and we had a program for people who didn't have a car, didn't have a way to get out. We had actual plans to kind of, everybody had to meet in certain places and get bussed out. Like there was, some communities have that, some don't, some have it at the, the 11th hour, but it's important to kind of think through that a little bit. And then one of the best ways to kind of keep up to date with what's going on, as well as to know if there's any kind of resources for sheltering, evacuations, what the danger is, what the risk is, what's kind of coming down the pipe, is making sure you're signed up for emergency alerts on your phone from the local emergency management in the place that you are in. That's really, really critical, because that can give you a lot of information, both in terms of preparedness, response, and recovery, and being able to kind of see and know what's going on and get that early warning if possible. A lot of folks, especially we find like with seniors, they might not have a lot of, I know my mom doesn't rock the smartphone. And so again, like there's a lot of folks who don't get emergency alerts, or who are not kind of really paying attention to that. But if you can actually get those, that's something that you can also share with people in your community. If you find out that there's like an evacuation, you can go knock on the door of one of your neighbors who you think might not know and help them get out in time, right? So it's a really important thing. And also in the aftermath of disaster, a lot of these emergency alerts from towns and cities are used to also promote different recovery services and things like that. So really helpful things to sign up for. Now, we're going to move in, we're going to leave behind like the self-preparedness thing to a certain degree. And we want to move into this idea of how do we collectively prepare and respond to disaster. And just shout out to Grace Lee Boggs. I found this on Instagram the other day. And just this idea of, we survive and we make it through incredible challenges by taking care of each other. And that is something I learned really intensely in New Orleans. And so I think it's something that want to bring that into, get a little bit away from the prepper mentality and more into the collective response mentality of this. Now, before we can kind of really talk about it, we need to acknowledge that in disaster, there are people in our communities, and also some of us, who are more impacted and are disproportionately impacted by different disasters, by different hazards. And these are folks who might do better if people actually were able to offer different supports, different supplies, different assistance, and that we should be kind of trying to create a more equitable and accessible landscape when it comes to both like preparedness, recovery, response, all of that. So, just naming a few people here, and it's not uniform, and this isn't everybody that we need to be thinking about, but I just wanted to acknowledge, like, if you're in a community and there's people in your community who are seniors, when we have things like extreme heat events, when we have things like wildfire smoke, they might be more impacted in terms of some of the physical impacts of that. When it comes to, last minute wildfire evacuations, a lot of the fatalities in certain areas have been seniors or people with disabilities because they weren't able to get out in time, or they didn't have someone, they were living alone, they didn't have someone who could, get them out or get the information to them. So, there's different ways that we kind of see these impacts happen. But, making sure like we are looking to, support people in our communities who are seniors, who may have a disability that makes mobility difficult, or that means that their body's going to react differently again to things like extreme heat or to wildfire smoke. Folks who have chronic health conditions. I have some myself. I go down really quickly in wildfire smoke because of some of my health challenges. And so again, it's like there's some folks who are going to be far more impacted. And what can we do as their neighbors and their friends and their family and their community members to support them and to make sure that they get out and get to recover like everybody else? People with mental illnesses. We've seen in extreme heat, actually in Vancouver, we had a heat dome in 2021. And when we looked at some of the fatalities from that heat dome, we saw a lot of like seniors, folks with medical conditions, folks who were socially isolated, and also folks who had schizophrenia, for example, because of some of the medications they were taking. It can also impact, again, how their bodies handle things like heat, right? So there's just a lot of different ways that folks are affected. Folks who have addictions and who are using substances, when they have to move and they're displaced, they might lose access to safe supply, right? And that's a huge issue. Outdoor workers, when we're dealing with, incredible air quality issues from wildfire smoke or extreme heat, we have a lot of folks who are still working outside in not really great conditions, and it affects them and it affects their health, like farm workers, construction workers. Undocumented community members, when we have disasters, we see that they often have to face both safety issues, the risk of, deportation, there's distrust of government and of law enforcement, and some really unsafe situations that they have to deal with. And they are also not as able to access a lot of the federal aid and, financial aid and income assistance because of their status. And there's just like time and time again, we see that folks in that community are very impacted, don't have the same access to recovery supports, and then also have to navigate, trying not to get deported or deal with that risk and that threat. New immigrants or folks who are coming who haven't been in that place before, it's not their climate. They have to deal with, a new setting. There might be language barriers as well. And it also might be triggering in terms of if they're coming as refugees, if there's past trauma. English as second language or non-English speakers. Again, if there's notifications, a lot of the forms people have to fill out for disaster recovery and supports, it's all in English. It's all kind of in kind of, or in maybe a few other languages, but it doesn't encompass everybody. We don't always have interpreters, ASL interpreters, or other options in some of these recovery centers or reception centers or evacuation. And so that can be a really intense experience for people. And so that is something to really watch out for and find ways to support folks when it comes to kind of filling out forms, getting the information, and all of that. Low income residents, whenever people are impacted by disaster, we have low income residents who are, first of all, maybe not going to have the same financial means to have all the preparedness pieces or to have all the food stocked up or things like that. We also often have low income residents living in homes or apartments or things like that are at a higher risk, basement suites or poor construction, more heat traps. And so again, the impacts will be greater. Often we also have low-income residents who are renters, and therefore they're more likely to be evicted and displaced and dealing with really shitty landlords in the aftermath of a disaster. Unhoused residents, when we're dealing with extreme heat and wildfire smoke, or people need to evacuate, it's like that is something where if you don't have a place to go to shelter indoors and to shelter away from the elements, your impacts physically are a lot worse and a lot higher chances of fatalities there. BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities and residents. First of all, we know that a lot of these communities are often in more high-risk locations because they've been pushed that way because of environmental racism, colonialism. They're sited near more toxic facilities, so that you could have these secondary events of like spills and releases, as well as the actual major disaster itself. And then we also deal with all these pieces around racism in the system, in terms of people being able to get approvals from FEMA or get, their financial aid approved. And also, from at least the Indigenous community's perspective, we see in Canada, like a lot of the impacts that we see in wildfires and floods are happening in two Indigenous communities. And they're not given the resources that they need to recover or to kind of mitigate and kind of have some of those things in place. And they have to deal with a whole level of government bureaucracy that a lot of other people don't have to deal with. And then in the States, you run into also issues with communities that are not recognized by the government, and therefore they don't have like a certain recognized status, and then it's a lot harder for them to get resources as well and to be treated with respect. And so there's a lot of different ways where, again, people are being impacted. They're not getting the recovery supports they need. They're not getting quick response. They're not getting proper notification. And they also aren't getting the money and the investment to actually have climate adaptation or mitigation that might give a bit of protection in some of these instances. A few other folks to just think through as well: pregnant women, because of just, again, if you're having extreme heat, wildfire, lots of high stressful situations, that's going to be impacting them. Children are precious. And again, certain hazards really impact them, both psychologically, but also physiologically, let's say heat and things like that. I already mentioned renters. And then I would finally add anybody who kind of lacks access to a computer, to having like a smartphone, and internet, is often disadvantaged in disaster recovery and in also preparedness and response, because they might not be getting the messages and all the kind of information ahead of time. But then a lot of the ways people apply for disaster aid is online now. And that can be really difficult for folks who don't have that access. So in thinking through all this, I guess one of the things I'm hoping is that, as you hear this, it's like, who are these people in your community? How are you one of these people, right? And also, like, how can we find better ways to kind of support and kind of create better situations here, and share resources and things like that. Now, we talked about disaster supplies for kind of preparedness individually. If you are thinking more collectively, and again, it's like, maybe you're an organization, you have like your own kind of mutual aid organization, or you're part of a faith organization, or you just are like really awesome person who's like, I want to stockpile some stuff to help out my neighbors, right? Just a few examples here of things you could have on hand, or that you as an organization could have, that would really help collectively in a disaster. And it really depends, again, what hazard you're dealing with. That's why there's like a big mix there. But again, if you're in a place where you have a lot of things where power goes out, and when we lose power, we lose things like air conditioning, which puts people into extreme heat stress in certain places. People who have medical needs where they need electricity for their devices, they're going to be heavily impacted. If you are someone who can afford a generator, that is something that can allow for your space to then become a collective place for certain people to come and have options and be taken care of, right? Or you can use that generator to put in a community space. So generators are gold in a lot of post-disaster situations. Having things like charge boxes and solar panels, also really helpful. If you are in a place where you are dealing with things like tornadoes and hurricanes, having tarps can be really helpful in terms of like tarping roofs and supporting, like, say you need a neighbor who could use that service from you. Different construction materials and tools are helpful supplies for mutual aid. Things like chainsaws, if you're good with a chainsaw, or you want to buy one, or you have a few, those are things that are invaluable in the aftermath of a lot of storms, and trying to clear roads and things like that, and help neighbors like get debris off their lawn if they have trees that have come down. Things like trucks and vans are really helpful for moving donations, for moving kind of meals and food and other things, or just putting people in the back and getting people to where they need to go. So that's a really interesting thing to be able to share with community. Again, going into the more like hurricane flood situation, boats, canoes, inflatables are amazing to have, and allows for folks to help do rescues. and to kind of move around in the aftermath when you still have like, waters and things like that. First aid kits and supplies. If you're someone who loves medic stuff, you've done a wilderness first responder course, I highly recommend people do that regardless, but having good first aid kits and supplies, even if you don't know how to use everything in it, somebody else might know how to use that, and that could be really helpful. If you have the ability to have any additional mobility devices like canes, walkers, wheelchairs, that can be really helpful for folks in the aftermath of disaster. Sometimes from a mutual aid perspective, there's certain organizations that have warehouses. That's invaluable in terms of being able to store donations and other things, things like pallet jacks, water, gas cards. This is something where a lot of people might have a car, but they can't afford to evacuate. And gas cards are something that you can give people that will help them get to where they need to go. Things like tents, large outdoor pop-up tents, tables, personal care donations like hygiene kits and baby formula, fans, dehumidifiers are also really helpful in the aftermath. And I've worked in a lot of communities where people are like needing that in the aftermath of a flood. Cooking equipment for large groups, that can definitely be something that can be really helpful if you're trying to make food and support people that way. And then things for cleaning, like cleaning buckets and different clean kits. So PPE, I also mentioned PPE on this, like there's lots of incidents where we've seen folks who are still having to work out in like really bad wildfire smoke, and you'll have really awesome folks and organizations go out and deliver like N95s to help kind of mitigate some of the impacts or things like that. All of those are really helpful things to consider. If you have a bit of money, or if your organization has some money and you're like, I want to get some of these things ready so that I can actually be able to share this with people, these things all help and can be very useful. Now, we're going to talk a bit about this later, but just kind of, again, really introducing that idea of how do we show up for our neighbors who are disproportionately impacted. And also, any of us can become disproportionately impacted, right? So it's like, it's paying it forward too. But just, as we're talking, like, what are your skills? What are the skills of your neighbors? Who in your community do you think might require additional assistance in the event of a disaster? Is this a person you can talk to ahead of time, and make a plan, or do you just want to keep your eyes out just in case and be ready to support, right? Who do you think might need assistance with evacuation? Who might need assistance with sheltering? If we're dealing with things like heat waves, is there ways to provide like cooling devices and cooling spaces to folks? Because we know that not everybody has air conditioning or can afford to pay for it. How do we outfit some of our community spaces, or even like our homes, to be a place that our neighbors and folks can take refuge in? Same thing with air filters, right? Is there folks that could really benefit from a bit of support in filling out disaster aid forms and financial aid forms, right? Who might need support when it comes to accessing mobility devices or medical care? Who requires assistance with language access? And do you know other languages or things like ASL? And is that something you can step up and support people with? And then also, what organizations can you work with locally? Because in every community, I mean, if you're in a community that gets hit by disasters a lot, there are a lot of organizations that are both kind of non-traditional disaster orgs as well as traditional orgs that, it would be good to kind of know who they are and be able to work with them or know what they might do in this event. But if you're not in this place where you have lots of disasters, what other local organizations do you want to kind of know and get to know? Because in any disaster, our local organizations, whether they do disaster work or not, if they're working with vulnerable populations, they will usually pivot to support them. And can you lend your skills to that? Can you support in that way? Now, a few things just to consider in terms of like focus areas with disasters. And this is, again, like when you're thinking through your skills, some of these might be things that you're like, I don't do that, I can't do that. Some of these might be things that you're like, oh, I could totally step in there. Or you might know different organizations in your communities that can do these things. But one of the first things to kind of consider is this idea of like pre-disaster land and house prep. So when we know we're coming into wildfire season, or we know like a hurricane is coming, there's different things that like you can do to kind of try to decrease the damage, right? Things like fuel reduction, removing different fuel sources from the land or around homes, catch basin cleanup when we're looking at things like extreme rain and hurricanes, sandbagging and filling up sandbags, moving furniture and projectiles indoors when we're dealing with like major wind and hurricane events, boarding up windows. These are all things that some folks are not able to do because they're physically demanding. I have long COVID. I wouldn't be able to do any of these things right now. So could really use help, right? If you have folks in your neighborhood who could use this, but maybe can't do it themselves, how can you step up and kind of provide some of that physical support and help make their home and kind of their chances of having the least amount of damage, right? Evacuation support. This is things like volunteering for your local town community that does evacuation work, or being able to like drive people out and kind of talk to people who you think might be isolated or might not have a vehicle and help them get out. Some folks like to do rescues. This is a very big thing down in the South in terms of, getting people out of the water and stuff like that. If you have boats and that's what you're down for, that's amazing. Shelter support. There's always a need for people to volunteer in disaster shelters, and a need for rad people to do it, and people who really are good and have good hearts. And so is that something that you might be interested in, right? Food and meal provision, that's something to also, there's probably a bunch of food bank kind of food organizations, maybe where you live. Folks who do food trucks are awesome at doing some of this as well. But in the aftermath of disaster, it's like there is a need to feed people. It's a really fun job. I used to work briefly with World Central Kitchen down in New Orleans, and it's one of the most gratifying things you can do post-disaster is make sure people are fed. But, do you have those talents, or is that something you're interested in? We also, in the aftermath of disaster, we have to look at things like cleaning up debris, right? So that's like, you have downed trees and all these kind of things that have come off roofs, cleaning up that kind of debris, what we call muck and gut when we're dealing with floods and hurricanes, where you have to kind of take everything out of a house and take it right down to the studs to avoid things like mold. That is a thing, that's a skill. And a lot of people do it wrong, and then they actually create really bad mold situations for the folks coming back. But there's some really great, we can send out some resources after, but there's some really great videos on how to do it right. And there's a lot of volunteer organizations that step up and do this in the aftermath of disasters. Things like ash sifting, that also happens in the aftermath of wildfire, where people are like needing help looking for valuable items and things in their home if their home has been burned. Other kind of things to consider with response and recovery, animal and livestock care. There are some great orgs like the SPCA. In BC, where I live, there's a group called CDART that do things around livestock and kind of getting livestock out or getting them to different places. You often see some really great mutual aid stuff where farmers will open up their land and their farm to other folks who are fleeing, who have things like horses and cows and stuff like that. Maybe that's something you can do, or maybe you just love animals and you want to help take care of them. Like that's definitely an area in disaster work. Donations are huge in the aftermath of any disaster. Usually they become a bit of a disaster themselves because everybody wants to give things, but they're not necessarily things people need. But there is a need to like get donations, to sort donations, to kind of be getting it to the people who need it. And so that's a huge thing. So if you're a good organizer, if you're good at like hustling and asking for stuff and setting up like systems, this is for you. Fundraising. We see a lot of like fundraising campaigns and GoFundMes and things like that in the aftermath of disasters because people need the funds. And it's something, especially in disaster, we see a lot of money and a lot of donations come right at the beginning, but people need that kind of funding throughout the process. Years down the line, they're going to need it because finally they're able to get home and they're able to get back. And it's like a year down the line and they don't have any furniture because everybody wanted to give that the first week of the disaster. Now we've moved on to 8 other disasters, but the people from that original disaster need the funding and it's gone. So there is a need to be continually thinking about how to fundraise for folks and how to get money that lasts through the recovery process. Childcare is critical. So often there are, either people offering free childcare during disasters, or if there's recovery centers and shelters and resilience centers, being able to offer childcare is so important because parents need to figure out, all the financial pieces and where they're going to go and what's going on with their home and housing. And so being able to kind of drop the kids off is very, very helpful, and good for people's well-being. Elder care and kind of providing care for folks who are either elderly or, again, dealing with different chronic health stuff. That is a need in a lot of different shelter situations, or even if people aren't in shelters, just checking up on those neighbors who are elderly and who you think might not be able to go out to the recovery center, go out, get the donations, and go out to the point of distribution for the food, like making sure that that is getting to them. First aid, health services, always important things to consider in disaster. Mental health support. So if you have a background in counseling, or you're just a really good empathetic listener and you want to take some training and kind of psychological first aid and things like that. These are really traumatizing events for people. And even if no major damage happens, even if it's a close call and people evacuate and nothing happens to their home, it triggers a lot for folks in terms of the trauma, the stress, and everything. So there's always a need to kind of assist with that, both in the kind of time of the disaster and also in the aftermath and years down the road and during anniversaries and things like that. Language access, I mentioned this earlier, translation, interpretation. Legal aid is huge. So folks who are lawyers or folks who know folks who are lawyers, there's a lot of really great legal organizations in the States that step up big time in providing assistance to folks in the aftermath of disaster in terms of, challenging denials by FEMA, dealing with like really bad landlords. There's a lot of places where people need that support. And so that's a helpful thing to be able to offer. And then, things like home repairs and rebuilding, like physical construction-y, things like that, are really, really helpful. Now, I just wanted to give a few examples and a lot less text, but just some examples of mutual aid and community response and ways that people have organized that are like really awesome in terms of supporting folks. So the picture on the left is a picture from this organization called IHAN, and I think it's Integrated Healers Action Network. And they're an organization in California that mobilized, I think, in the 2017 Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa. They might have been doing work before then, but that's when I heard of some of their work. And they're an organization of different healers, naturopaths, acupuncturists, massage folks, and they were offering kind of free services to evacuees as well as first responders. And that's like a really cool thing because it's something that folks could very much use in terms of dealing with stress and also the impacts of smoke and things like that. The picture in the middle is from an amazing organization called Imagine Waterworks. And they are a mutual aid organization in New Orleans. And in multiple hurricanes, they get donations. They have a really amazing Facebook group where people post what they need. And, there's this kind of idea of like people post what they need and then they try to find ways to source that. And other people in the community are on that Facebook group and lots of different people are trying to step in and help out. And then there's other times where they just do straight up kind of organizing, getting lots of different things like heaters and kettles and fans and whatever they're kind of seeing as the major need from that community, get it down to that community and deliver it. In one of the hurricanes, when I was working for the city of New Orleans during Hurricane Zeta, and then they did the same thing in Hurricane Ida, we had parts of the city of New Orleans that lost power, but not all of it. So it was like different parts kind of go out and some parts stay. And what they did is they actually kind of reached out and said, who has power, who doesn't? If you have power, are you willing to kind of be kind of a charge station for the community? And a lot of different people were like, yes. And then they basically put their houses and things on a map. And some of these folks put out little charge and little kind of power bars out on their decks, as well as like cold water and things like that. And it was something that the city ended up publicizing so that neighbors and everything who needed to charge their phone or something like that could go to these places and their neighbors and kind of nearby them and actually get a bit of power during kind of an outage. So lots of creative ways that people kind of are coming together with their skill sets or kind of utilizing what some people have in the community to make it available to everybody else. A few ideas for extreme heat and wildfire smoke. So there's lots of different things that people do. Up in Canada, we don't have a lot of folks who have air conditioning because we've always gotten away without it in the West. I think the East is a bit different. But there's a lot of issues of people not having AC. And when I was working with the city of Vancouver last year, there was a lot of work that we were doing with different community organizations and neighborhood houses and nonprofits where we were distributing what we call cool kits. And they were basically these kits that had like low tech kind of cooling options. So like they had ice packs and like cooling towels and like a thermometer so people knew how hot it was indoors. So they could actually be like, I need to leave. They had like a foot bath. They had a spritz bottle, little kind of light touch things like that. And what we were also looking into and kind of moving towards was also things like cooling vests. Because that is like more helpful for certain folks like who have maybe spinal cord injuries and things like that in terms of kind of cooling a person down. But like there's things like that we can offer our neighbors and we can distribute. Some folks, there was an amazing organization in Vancouver called CALSA Aid. They're a Sikh disaster organization that actually bought a bunch of air conditioners, portable air conditioners, and then got them into different childcares and different seniors, low-income senior housing buildings. And so they could have their own little cool room in those buildings. So not everybody had an AC, but there was a place on site they could go to get some cooling, right? Other organizations just made sure that they opened up their doors to folks who needed cooling and did different programming and stuff to get folks into a place that had like an AC. Some folks put out community coolers and community fridges with like popsicles and stuff like that. There's like a lot of different things people can do with extreme heat. And then while this is all happening, if you live in a community that is like a city or something, usually the city is doing cooling centers and stuff like that. But a huge barrier is a lot of folks can't physically get to the cooling center. A lot of our seniors are folks with mobility issues. They can't physically get there because to take the bus during the heat is impossible. So folks offering rides or like getting folks to those places is really, really critical. People doing wellness checks for their neighbors. Again, a lot of the folks who died in the heat dome in 2021, a big number of them were folks who were socially isolated and they didn't have people checking up on them, right? So being able to see if someone's okay, to get them medical attention if they're not, is really critical. When it comes to wildfire smoke, again, it's like, how do we get things like air filtration to people? Because I think anyone who's tried to buy an air filter, it's really expensive. There's some interesting things where folks will make DIY air filters, like these Corsi Rodensol boxes. And that is something that City of Vancouver with a bunch of other partners was actually doing these DIY air filter workshops, which was pretty awesome, where people would make these DIY air filters, all the materials were free, and then they get to take them home and they would have at least something to help with the wildfire smoke. Other organizations sometimes just buy air filters and again, like put it in like a room that's a common room in the apartment complex so that people have some kind of break from the pollution. Making clean air shelters, any of those things are options, but just lots of different ways where it's like, how are we getting people the devices they need, the equipment they need, or providing these shelter spaces that make it so that people aren't going to be impacted physically to a point where they end up being in the hospital or worse. Now, I just wanted to quickly mention with disasters, there's all this stuff that like people can do. And then there's this thing where if we have a big disaster, you usually have a lot of nonprofit organizations kind of come in or kind of spin up. And you might be part of a nonprofit already, or maybe you are an organizer. And if you are in a community where there isn't like a coalition, like if there isn't some kind of organizing already happening around kind of different community organizations getting together and talking about disaster and how they would step up in response and recovery. If you have the ability to convene that, I highly recommend you do, because that makes such a difference in the amount of just how much resources get into a community, how quickly people get the care they need, and people don't fall through the cracks as much. In the States, we tend to call these organizations COADs or BOADs, which is voluntary organizations active in disaster. And they are these coalitions of all these different groups. In Canada, we sometimes call them recovery committees, things like that. But making sure that the groups in your area are like talking about disaster or organizing. If there is a disaster, is there a way for all these groups to get on a conference call? Do people kind of know who to talk to and kind of who's going to do what? That's important. And I think, if you're into kind of planning that and making that happen, there's a lot of different organizations that you want to have at the table. So there's always the very traditional disaster response and recovery organizations. Like we all know those folks like the Red Cross and Salvation Army, the food banks, in the States, folks like World Central Kitchen, Team Rubicon, like these guys go from disaster to disaster. And they bring a lot of resources with them. People don't always dig their politics and how they roll, but they can do really good things. And if you have something big enough in your community, they're likely going to show up anyway. So it would be really good to probably try to plug them into the local ecosystem as much as possible so you can channel what they're doing. You also want to have disability organizations, cultural organizations, houses of worship, seniors organizations, different health organizations, indigenous organizations, food justice organizations, legal aid and assistance. If there's folks in your community who are already doing work around housing and getting people housed, you want them on those committees. If you have people who are already doing work around animal stuff, you want them on those committees. If you have local philanthropy, and folks who are like the money folks who do all the grants, you want them on those committees. And if you have all those folks together, what happens is that you actually have people say, these are the resources, this is what our organization can do. And then you have other groups on those calls and on those kind of planning that are like, well, our people need those. Like they're already working with some of those vulnerable communities and vulnerable residents, and they can get those resources to the right people. And that's really, really important. And if you have groups like this already, it means that the money that comes in to the community in the aftermath of disaster can hopefully be channeled better into kind of midterm and long-term recovery, because they can kind of guide it that way. So really encourage people to try to organize those things. And even if you want to do it in just like the groups that you're a part of, that's awesome. But it's like having this in place makes a huge difference in kind of responding to disaster. I think we're almost done. Yeah, this is you, Charles.
Yeah, so I wanted to continue on what I was saying before. Let me get my camera on here.
Yeah.
I wanted to say more about this idea of how ecology works. So when you look at a natural environment, and we look at this idea of like disturbance versus disaster, like, what is the way that we can be more like the natural world? Like, how do we design and be in our spaces where, all this stuff that Leila is talking about? There's like, how do we shift from disaster to disturbance? When we look at floodplains, like where you have flood ecosystems, evolved for it, it actually needs it. Like, or 2/3 of the insects in areas that have floodplains have part of their life cycle that is aquatic, and they need it. Like without it, they won't survive, and which means that fish populations and pollination, all sorts of things don't happen without it. In fire ecosystems, if the disturbance doesn't happen, you don't get regeneration. Like there just isn't any regeneration. If there's, if you're in somewhere that has regular storms, like regeneration is baked into how the ecosystem works. And the question is, how do we have our human world respond to our ecology? So if we live in places that get storms, even if it's changing, like where I live here in Atlantic Canada, in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, like there's predicting that we're going to have 4 times as many hurricanes as we have in past years because of the warm Atlantic Ocean and the shifting of kind of weather cycle. So we're getting more of it, but still we can say, okay, so how do we use that to help us move forward? Like, how does that help us with our own resilience in our own community? Like, are we connected as a community in that when disturbance happens, it brings us together versus shatters us apart? Is there a way in which, we're able to do the solidarity work, that really showing up for each other, being ready so that we're, when disturbance happens, that we're able to knit together? So I just challenge this idea that like it has to be this disruptive thing. And often part of the things that I see happening in these disasters is that we've pinned our success, our life, our ability to function on these really big systems that we have no control over. Like we don't like how many people, how many when you think about how many, like you have very little control. Like you don't put up the electrical lines. You couldn't even repair electrical line if you wanted to. So you might live off grid. Maybe you have an agency around that, but for the vast majority of us, live on grid. Like where does our fuel come from? Well, a car, maybe you can fix your car, but you need the parts. Roads that are maintained by big systems. We have all these big systems that take care of parts of our lives. Our food, where does it come from? The grocery store. How much agency do we have in impacting that? Like how do we localize in such a way? How do we bring ourselves together in such a way that we can model ourselves more after nature and less after like these large centralized systems that are with the nexus of power far away? So I think how we start to bring together. And the other part that I'm excited about is that as we move into this time when disaster is happening, disturbance is happening, we have a choice of how do we want to reconstruct, like when things happen, and they very well could. And it's unlikely that we're all going to get struck, but it's likely that we're going to feel the impact of it. Like the likelihood that somewhere burns around and people are going to come into where I live is pretty good. And that then there's this idea of like, how do you rebuild? When I've watched disasters go through floods in New England, when Irene went there, it's really amazing to watch. Like it washed out all these roads, washed out farm fields, and there's this huge push to rebuild. And in that push to rebuild, all the environmental laws kind of went out the window. Like they're like, not going to look at environmental laws. We need a road, and they just would dump, rock in to fill areas and put culverts in, and the streams were just muddy. And it was really, really hard on the ecology because we needed those roads, and we rebuilt the same roads in the same places in the same way. And if another storm comes through that's the same size, they'll be taken out again. Like, how do we rebuild? How do we use these moments and not have a complete loss? Where we say, okay, a horrible thing happened. What a loss. Let's rebuild the same thing in the same place. So how can we start to have disturbance be something that makes us stronger, knits us together, makes us more engaged? What comes after it, what evolves after that is actually something that we want, that may be different than what we had. Like, is the world where we want right now? Is it built in the way we want it? Is it functioning in the way we want it? Like, if there's a disturbance that kind of shook that up, would we rebuild it in the same way? And how do we get ready for that? So I ask these things out, and I posit them out. In our classes, we talk more about like how would we do that, but I put it out there to you all, like in your communities, how do we show up for each other in such a way that when disturbance happens, we grow something, we become more resilient, we pull it back together. So yeah, I'm gonna just let that sit for a moment. Just think about how do we function more like a natural ecosystem.
Charles,
Yes.
this is Marta.
Hello.
I am from Central America, and we have a lot of problems there. Some that have been created by humans, mostly by people that have taken all the resources.
Yep.
And others because we haven't been taking care of things throughout 500 years. So one of the things that helps us is building community, doing things together. Some people do for some certain things and other people for other things. But then when something happens, they know each other and they know what they can do. And then they lift it to a different level.
Mm-hmm.
When we have breaks, and in each of those times, we know what to do. The problem that we have is that the administrations of government, they hoard all the money and they hoard all the equipment, and then we have to do as we can. But a lot of that has to do with international policies. How a country is impacting on the other country to keep policies that are helpful to the other countries. Basically, countries of the north wanting to have things that we don't really need, like monocultures. We don't need it. Avocados are very good, but then when everybody just wants to have avocados because they like it and they're going into all this, we have a lot of disasters that have come from there. Because in monoculture you don't take care of the land any longer, and then you are in terms of giving to whatever you are creating. But that usually is controlled by the people that have the land and the people that get the support by the administration of government. So what I'm saying is that, in a sense, what I'm saying is that, people have the goodwill generally. There are people that sometimes are not going to be like that, but we can incite that. I mean, we can have all kinds of processes. And for example, we have festivals where everybody comes and shares it, even if it's a festival to exchange seeds. But then the people that do prevention, the people that do health, everybody that comes and enriches that particular process. I think that that's very democratic, and that's what we call culture of peace, because at the end it allows us to have some peace of mind. But democracy is very important, and that is what I'm seeing that is eroding everywhere, including in your country, because I see very individualism. There are still people that really care, but mostly it's about getting more money as fast as you can, and then like right now, they are making arrangements for banks to be making decisions um, on your bank account. I was just helping somebody that received the letter and say, you have been you have been successful as to get this particular bank account, but then it went to tell her that if she doesn't have so much money in there, they are going to be deducting from her money that they are keeping there that's coming for the Social Security. So I'm saying that a lot of this, that all the disasters come because we allow the artistry of things to be destroyed. Because that's what disaster is.
Yeah.
Art is about doing things, and this is a negation of working together and doing those things.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And Marta, thank you for that. That coming together, and there's the international piece. When we talk about the solidarity piece, and Leila, I think you touched on a lot of pieces, but like how are we hosting people when we're there, but also especially North American, how are the policies that I have some agency over, like I can vote, like I can engage, that it affects people far off. Like how are we in solidarity with people in other places too, so that we can support, because economics drives, like it is a huge driver, and there's no doubt about it. Like the development of many places have been pushed to have systems that are fragile because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to put to push for these monocultures that are really not sustainable, but also they're really fragile to disturbance. It's not like a polyculture. It's not like diverse. It's like one thing happening, the whole thing can be taken out. So I think there's a lot of work to do, both around our kind of community solidarity and how we support people even from afar. So why don't we stop the screen share? It seems like there's some hands. And then I'm going to try to put us onto gallery view so we can see some more folks here. And maybe we'll just chat a little bit about how we can be in solidarity with each other. And there's a lot of Mariahs in this group. I'm not sure how we got 30 Mariahs. I'm sure you're not all Mariahs. So I'm not going to call you by name, but we have one of the Mariahs that had their hand up first. If you want to, if you feel comfortable turning your camera on, be great. And then you can speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how my name got changed to Mariah.
I don't know, but that's okay. Go for it. You're up.
Okay. I'm Rose, also from Atlantic, Canada. Now, what was I going to say? Oh, I think a really interesting thing has been happening within communities like farmers. I think of organizations like Farmers for Climate Solutions, and they have been really good at using the political system and the economic arguments for more sustainable farming. And basically when the new government came in with Trudeau a few years ago, they were the first in the door for the new Minister of Ag and said, here's the economic proposition for more sustainable farming. We can do it. What we need is this, this, and this. And they sat down. They were the first people through the door before all your usual lobbyists. And they got everything they asked for because they had their arguments right. They represented a lot of farmers, including very big farmers who were changing over to more sustainable techniques. And I think that's a way that people can use the system instead of always going up against it, is to say, how can I use this? How can we come together and be a voice that has to be listened to, for example, from an economic standpoint? So, and they have helped and spawned even more organizations that are now making an impact. So, it's things like that, ask what do the people around you, your local government and everything, what makes them tick? Where can we intersect for a mutual interest that they don't even know yet?
But it takes preparation, right? Like a lot of this is looking ahead enough to walk in that door, to having done the
and
work,
be willing to take the conversations and,
take it.
To have conversations rather than just yelling.
Yes. Yeah. And we've got the next Mariah. Has the hand up. Oh, did you want to speak?
Oh yeah. Hi.
Hi.
It's a little hard with 30 Mariahs to really keep track. So, I'm an organizer. I needed a little bit of direction. I got some really good stuff from this webinar, so I'm going to continue to attend them. Now, the challenge is we have way too many people all over the US that we're connected with, and there's little to no strategy. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to create like a sociocratic map where people can find online or in-person resources where they know an intentional community near them, so they can shift to a regenerative, safe place that has not been affected or something, where when people get together, they have a place to go. And it's kind of hard, and I'm kind of new to organizing with so many people involved. So I wanted to know where I could go to get some help, honestly, from some experienced person, because I don't want to, it feels like someone's livelihood is like with me, and I want to make sure I do things where there's nothing at the bottom and people can transition into regenerative systems and stuff in a good way.
Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah. So where are you located?
I am in Raleigh.
Raleigh, North Carolina?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's great. I really think it's awesome what you're doing. And I think there needs to be more of that, right? Because I think people, again, when we see a lot of these disasters, people get displaced, and they're being displaced for long periods of time, and for longer than normal because of the housing crisis that we're also in, right? So having places people can go is important, right? And I think the more people think about that,
going to fall apart too.
yes,
yeah,
places that are resilient, right?
We're saddled with 112,000 people, and we're kind of like newbies, and we really need some help because it took off really fast, but we just need some help.
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat, and if you just want to reach out to me, we can like chat about it.
Oh my gosh, thank
Yeah,
you.
no
Yeah,
problem.
okay, cool.
I'm stoked you're doing it. Like, it's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Oh,
And you
you're
guys
gonna
get
be so much
hurricanes and
help.
everything in North Carolina. So like,
Oh
we're
yeah, this is we're global, by the way. It's not just North Carolina, so it's like all
yeah,
across, I mean, not global, but like US based. So all across the US and like different states. It's like so many people.
awesome.
Would love some help. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to put my email in there if anybody has any other questions, or if you are working on something really rad where you are organizing for kind of disaster resilience and mutual aid, please feel free to reach out to me. I might not always respond super quick, but I will definitely get to it.
Kristen, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, it was that very moment my kid spoke to me.
The timing.
Um, that just immediately made, because so I think, Leila, that you answered my question actually in the moment that I put my hand up, which was just ongoing networking, because I too, I'm working with a national group of people who are inquiring into developing more of a clear sense of climate chaplaincy. And so I'm really curious about that sort of has a developing edge there. And so I just really, the same thing with Mariah Master, what you were speaking about. And I'm very interested in like, how do we continue to stay connected with these, progressive minded movements to support each other? Because I've also been through disasters and seen the whole process with the VOAD and all of that. And, and the how people sometimes get, lost in the cracks and all of the stuff that happens. So anyway, so I just love to be more, I just want to find out how we can continue to stay in touch with each other.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've actually never heard of climate chaplaincy, and I love the sound of it because I can kind of get what it is. And I think it's great that you're doing it because I want to know more. I know Charles put into the chat, we're going to be doing more courses and longer courses on this because this is a really quick thing where it's just like, a lot of information. I'm going to be teaching a course that's going to be like a 6-week course on kind of community response recovery, where I think there's going to be a lot more time for us to kind of talk about organizing and kind of plans and things like that. And that's going to be next spring. But I also wanted to say the thing you mentioned about VOADs and COADs, like I briefly brought this up, but a lot of communities that are hit by disasters might have these, or they've had them at one time or another. They sometimes go dormant. Not all of them are created equal. Like some places you'll have a VOAD where they're very exclusive and they only have the big traditional disaster organizations in them. And if that's what you're dealing with, you might want to organize something else, or try to get into that and try to make it better. Some places have COADs and VOADs that are like the right way. Like they have all the right people at the table. They're thinking outside the box, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think there's a way where that concept of VOAD, COAD comes from emergency management. And it comes from, like, I have training in emergency management, but it's a very it can be a very in the box kind of way of thinking where they're like only certain people with credentials get to be at the table. And those are not necessarily the folks who are getting into the communities or really reaching the people who need the support. And so there's a need for, again, folks who are organizers, who are rad, who are creative, to kind of expand that concept and to make it what it should be, right? And to make it beautiful and diverse and inclusive and have a lot of elements of justice at the table. And so it's just like, that's a bit of like, if you can do that, do it, make that happen.
Yeah, so of these classes, Bear, I see you. 1 second. In the chat, I put a few of the classes that are coming up. So we've got Lila's going to do a bioremediation course, which is really talking about how do we clean up toxins, envirotoxins, especially in the soil, a little bit in water, using biology, bacteria,
Plants,
fungi,
mushrooms,
plants,
bacteria.
yes. So highly encourage that if you're looking at like responding to disasters and the toxicity that comes along that, or like long-term stuff. That's a really great class. We've got a couple classes coming up next spring. The registration is going to open in late July. So there'll be an email go out if you want to be on that list. We've sent out a survey. You've seen it, fill that out, and we'll make sure you get on the list and you get an email about it. Or just check the Earth Actors Training website. In late July, there's going to be one kind of like disaster management plan, kind of focused on organizations, but anybody can take it to kind of come up with a plan. And then there's going to be the community response class. So we're going to do both of those. Highly encourage them to come join us for those. Okay, Bear.
I am curious if there is any trainings on how to become an organizer and host these spaces from a more permaculture perspective, because there is a lot of stuff about preparing for disasters or first aid, etc. But when it comes to more of a regenerative approach and being a regenerative and resilient organizer, I struggle to find things like that. And so I was curious if you have any options.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. Maybe Charles on the organizing front. I don't know if there's something. I mean, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but just to kind of what you said about the regenerative side of things, and I didn't put any of this in this presentation, but there has been some really amazing kind of disaster response recovery things that have happened from like kind of a permaculture lens. Like I think about, especially with wildfire, we've seen this kind of like permaculture bioremediation approach in California a few times where like community folks who are permaculturalists, who are mycologists, and other folks just kind of come together and do really great work at trying to, install things to keep all the toxins from going into the water. Or if you want to look up the Maui Bioremediation Coalition, did an incredible like effort post the Lahaina wildfire. They came together to kind of try to put this solution into play of like, hey, instead of us taking all this toxic ash and kind of the aftermath of the fire and put it in a dump and pollute other things, can we use bioremediation? And they were doing incredible work in terms of like organizing and education and engaging with, different community folks to do it. So there's good examples of like different communities doing that. A few, not as much as there should be, but yeah. Charles, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I see your hand. We'll get you in a second. So, yeah, I'd say there's a lot of communities that are teaching organizing, depending on what you want to organize around. Usually, the organizing trainings that I know of are around a set of issues. Like people are organizing around an issue, and there'll be trainings around organizing. But if you're interested in just like general organizing, the Alliance of the Community Trainers is doing some good stuff on and off. Yeah, there's a number of folks doing stuff. So Bear, we can chat. We've got each other's emails, so we can chat about some of the other options. And maybe we'll run an organizing one if there's enough interest, or if that just training might put one on around how to organize under kind of permaculture and kind of social activism context. So I don't know if it's Jay or Jai. Your hand was up.
Yeah, it's Jay.
Jay.
I was just wanting to respond to that question, and I didn't see the name of the person who asked that. Sorry, I missed that.
Bear.
But
it's Bear.
Bear. Okay. There's actually a training through the Women's Permaculture Guild. It's called the Social Systems, their Advanced Social Systems Design. And specifically, there's a mentor in that program whose name is Mailing Colorado, and she is an amazing organizer and activist who now lives in Spain, but was like really actively involved with the Standing Rock organizing. And she was teaching me about like the integration of the social systems and permaculture design kind of like placed in the context of organizing. So that might be, I think, Mailing Colorado. I think I wrote it in the chat, so you can Google Mailing Colorado and then the Women's Permaculture Guild. They have a lot of like modular learning on that website. And I know you have to pay for some of it, but there's some that are free resources.
Great, thank you.
Source.
So, Rose, I see your hand. Then we're going to go into a little exercise to wrap us up.
It just suddenly hit me that the training for transition, you know, and the book, the first book, I think it's called Training for Transition, but correct me if I'm wrong, is a fantastic kind of blueprint for an approach to bringing people together in the community. And I still, one of my favorite things to do is always the World Cafes, because you can get a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas sitting down, and they're thinking solutions, and they're thinking not just response or reaction. They're thinking about prevention. They're thinking about, well, what more could we do, and discovering and working, you know, different people around the table with all their resources and stuff. So that can be a way to get things started. And, you know, start small. Start with what you know, with who you know, and then take it from there. And, you know, in Raleigh, North Carolina, they found out just how dang fast they can grow. So, so now they have a different problem. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So many good things going on around. What I would do is close out with a couple little questions for you, a little exercise. So I'm gonna share my screen, and we're gonna go to a thing called Menti, and it's gonna ask 2 questions. The first question is gonna be about what you can bring in solidarity, what you can bring in case of disaster in your area, and the second will be about what your communities can bring. So I'm just going to see what we have in this group, because a group like this often brings an incredible set of skills and talents and tools to our situations. So so you can go here. Either you can go on your computer with like a second tab on your browser or whatever, or you can take a shot with your phone. I'll leave this up for a moment so people can get on. Then we're going to see. Okay, we ready? Yeah, I'm gonna head over to the next one. And if you can't get on, you can put it in the chat. You can also put this in the chat. So what personal skills or tools do you have that, if a disaster struck, that you could offer to your community?
Herbal remedies. I like that.
Yeah.
Counseling, restorative. Yes. First aid, food, all the good things.
Mm-hmm.
Somatic grant writing. Didn't really mention that. We mentioned it kind of under fundraising, but that is so important.
I also think there's specific things, like if you have a chainsaw.
Chainsaws.
Like if you have, you know, if you have a vehicle, you know, a boat, if you live in somewhere there's floods, you know, I got a canoe, like, you know, those are things too, you know, facilitating nice job. Coolers and storage, nice.
Yes.
Remedies.
Great.
Paper recycling. Cooking, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Oh, someone has a boat. I saw a boat.
Nice. Art supplies, nice. Art supplies, great.
Yes.
Because, you know, you spend a lot of time like being busy, but also a lot of time sitting around to so having things for people to do, especially the kids. Like, you know, what else can you do?
And if you're an artist, like people who are artists and entertainers, that is so like all these cooling centers and places where people like could go and like spend time in. A lot of people don't want to go and spend time in them because they're boring. And often there's this thing of like, well, what if there was actual like events or art or like music or something entertaining happening in these spaces so that people could be, you know, distracted or actually amusing themselves in different ways. So like, if that's your skill set, if you clown, like there's a need, there's always a need. House with space. That's awesome.
Shade tree. Nice. Got some trees. Grounding support.
Yeah. A talented group of people. These are all great.
Yeah.
Really wonderful.
Driving, cooking, art, senior support.
Shovels, firelight stove. Right on. Pet care, like all of these things are needed, you know?
And if you did this with your community, if you got
Mhm.
together with, any number of people in your community, 5 people, 10 people, 100 people, and you start to see, what do we got? Like, what's there? You start to set this out, you can really see like, oh, there's a lot of things. The other thing you can notice is there something missing? Like, oh, we've got all this. Oh, is there another thing? Or to, realize like, oh, is there anything you're seeing on this list you didn't think about? You're like, oh, I've got that. Like, oh yeah, I can do that too. That you might not have thought of. It's a good way to like pull in.
Also, there's a few people who've answered in the chat, so I just want to say them. Construction, great. Healing touch, also wonderful. Someone's a licensed vet tech. Yes, and they have a van and a kayak. I'm hanging out with this person. They also have solar panels. These are all great things. We have someone else who can offer herbal remedy knowledge and apothecary. That's amazing. Massage therapy, food and medicine. There's some really great medic groups that actually set up at different both events and like post-disaster situations, and they actually have like an herbal apothecary and offer that to people. So that's an amazing thing to also be able to share. Yeah. Registration, lots of good things. And obviously a lot of people, so when we see kind of bigger text on this, those are the things where more people are saying that. So we actually have quite a lot of people here who can cook and facilitate, which is wonderful.
And driving medical coming in near after that.
Yes,
Okay, so,
great. Awesome.
Yeah. So you can continue put on this at the end of this when I post we're going to be sending you all a link to the recordings if you want to watch it again. But in that sending, we're going to add some of the slides. So if you want some of the lists, we can send some of those out, and I'll add in this word cloud with the things on it. It won't have any of his names. It'll just be like what we said. So y'all can see what all was said. So you can feel free to continue to add to this, but I'm going to move to our next slide that you all will have a chance to answer, because this is another part of showing up. Is we show up individually, like, oh, I've got my boat, or I can do massage, but we're all part of a community. Maybe you're part of Boy Scouts, or maybe you're part of a church, or maybe you're a singing group, like maybe you sing kirtan with 4 other people, and like, okay, that's your group. Or maybe you have a hiking group, or maybe you have, a permaculture group, like whatever. Like, what does your community have to offer? And they have offered different things. Maybe you live in a collective house. Like collectively, what you have, maybe you have extra bedrooms, maybe you have, spaces, maybe you have, you have the ability to make a bunch of phone calls because there's a bunch of you, and you have a network. You have like somewhere you can gather for food. Like, what do you have? What can your community offer, like collectively, that you can bring to bear?
Disaster medical, yes. Reiki, awesome.
Are you part of a community? Are you part of a group, family, even a loose, like a knitting circle, the quilting club, the swim team, like what is it that collectively, when you start to look at, oh, this group, what do they have access to? Or might they have access to if you thought about it?
Like community kitchens, like maybe you're with a house of worship or a faith group that has vans or like mini buses. Those are gold. What do you got?
Yeah, maybe you're part of a summer camp community in the summer, and when you think about, oh, what does a summer camp have? Like, oh yeah, they might have vehicles, they might have some space, they have some camping gear. You go to university, like if you're members of university and you're a university group, like you often have access to some of the university infrastructure. Like, is there some of that you can leverage, or do you even put as a university member, put pressure on the university to open up spaces?
Like a lot of disasters happen in the summer, and a lot of residences and dorms are available. Like that's like something, I guess if you work for a university, can you push to be open about that, right? And let that be a solution for people.
Lions Club, boat docks. Yeah. Having a place somebody can bring a boat in or out, launches and docks. Yeah, very important. Like if you have a boat, but you can't, like, where do you put in? Where do you put out? Like those are important things, especially with good access.
And is there anywhere in your community, like, is there community centers or organizations or houses of worship, or even maybe like certain small businesses that are really community minded that have backup power, that have a generator or solar or something that could be a place that ends up being utilized post-disaster? People don't always agree to doing things before, but when the disaster hits, they sometimes will be like, yes, you can use my space, or, you know, and those places that might not lose power, or that might be a bit more structurally hardy, those are things you want to map in your community and try to either have some of those initial conversations or, you know, be ready to reach out after.
And, you know, as you know, working in lots of nonprofits and community centers, like it's, there is funding, especially for organizations that reach out to the municipalities or the states or the provincial governments and be like, hey, we want to be a community center in case of disaster. Can you fund us a generator? Can you get one in? Can we get, you know, food? Can we get some radios? Can we get, like, becoming a place and doing that fundraising early on? Because there's funds out there, disaster funding, emergency response funding, community development fund, like that's out there. And just ask to, like, reach out, as because organizations have leverage in a way that individuals don't always have the same leverage. So you can, you know, have access to funds and places to store things.
There's a great, like, Project Footprint is an organization in the States that actually shows up a lot in post-disaster and sets up solar for different, like, community hubs and stuff like that. They're an interesting group. If you're ever hit by something, you want to reach out to them and ask for support. There's also a lot of folks have been in the chats. Folks are saying land for creatures in tents. That is really helpful. And you see that a lot in disasters. A lot of people have to evacuate and they have horses and they have, you know, livestock with them and they can't go to a regular shelter, or they can't go, like, there's nowhere for their animals. And so people who can offer spaces for their animals, it's it takes a lot of load off. Large warehouse, bulk food store, that's amazing. Choir or theater. Free store, amazing. People love free stores. Another thing I wanted to actually bring up when it comes to donations, there is this thing often where people, like, there's things people needed in a disaster that people assume they need, and then there's things that people actually need that, like, those needs don't get met. And I think one of the biggest things in disaster when people are struggling is giving choice and dignity is so important. And there are folks who set up things like free stores, or when I was working in New Orleans, we actually had a few thrift stores come to us when we were supporting all these evacuees from Lake Charles, Louisiana. We had a bunch of thrift stores come to us and actually say, if any of these people need to come get clothing, they can come to the thrift store for free and get whatever they need. And that gave people the ability, instead of, like, you know, just being given something and it, like, has to work for them, they got to go pick what they needed and they had a little bit more choice over size and stuff like that. So if you have anything like that, or someone who's willing to kind of do some of that work, that's really helpful. Somebody else said they're having trouble with the Menti, which is totally understandable, but they have an off-grid community that has 50 years experience in meetings, watershed restoration, emergency radio networking, and self-organizing. That is an awesome community to be a part of. Great. And someone else said, my community of disabled and neurodivergent folks are really skilled at considering access needs and how to approach folks in ways that are respectful and individualized. And that is so important, because a lot of things around access needs get thrown out the window in disaster response and recovery. And there's a lot of organizations that do not pay as much attention to that as they need to. They don't prioritize it. And so folks who are willing to make sure that that is happening in a good way, or at least trying to educate the folks who are providing services to respect people, is so important. So thank you for doing that.
So we've come to our hour and a half, and I know there's more we can do because this is a huge, giant topic. And, you know, as this summer goes on, it's going to become, you know, larger and more real for people. So what I want to just remind us of as we go forward is that, you know, disturbance doesn't have to be disaster, though it often can be. that we need to take care of ourselves, so that we don't become a burden, but also we have this role of hosting, that we have this role of like showing up for other people. It might not strike us, it might not strike our community, but how can we be that for somebody else? Like, how can we be that support? Because that's part of the resilience. Like, that's part of response, isn't being like, am I ready to take care of myself? Like, if the bad things happen, which yes, that needs to happen, but am I ready to help other people out? Have I looked around enough to even know who they are? Do I know the people who are at risk around in my community? Do I have relationships that if things go badly, that not that there's somewhere I can go, which is good to know, but are there ways that I can support other people? Am I available in a way, can I show up? And how can we do that? How can we be there for each other? So there's so much more to talk about. We have these other classes coming up in the spring that I hope you come on and join us for. But we'll have more pop-ups as the summer goes along, so watch out for those.
And I guess I'll add just in a positive note. And I feel like Marta brought this up a little earlier, but this idea that what I've seen when I've worked in places that have been hit by disaster, especially those places that have been hit multiple times, there is such a culture of people like skilling up, but really showing up. And it's not just for their community. Like, I've worked in communities that when another community has to evacuate, it's like you're trying to fight people off to help that community. Like, people want to help so bad. And I think in the world that we're coming into, there's this concept of like things getting more and more disjointed and things breaking down and people being isolated. And I think there's this other reality that cuts through that, where people come together and they really do take pride and like a sense of like beauty and really showing up for other communities, for the people in their community. And there's a need to fight for that too, right? Because in disaster, there's a lot of injustice that happens, and we need to be taking care of each other and taking care of each other for the long haul. Because response is a really beautiful thing in the way that there's a lot of outpouring of support. Everyone's really excited, feelings are high, but then a lot of folks don't get to recover at the same speed of other people because the system is pushing them down and pushing them back. And so there needs to be this sustained support and this like focus on making sure we all get to move forward and recover and come home if we want to come home. And so I think there's a lot of beautiful work to be done around that. Not for the faint of heart, but for the big of heart. So rock it out.
Well, I'm going to say goodnight to you all. We'll see you around. I have a little music to play us out. You can dance along or pop on out, however it goes. Thanks for joining us.
Bye, everyone. And may you have an easy summer and a very chill, no disaster summer.